Good afternoon, folks from across Canada joining us this afternoon. And I am Mark Spiro, and I am pleased to introduce our friend and our colleague from a very, very early morning in Melbourne, Australia, Brian Loughnane. Brian, many of you who've been involved in Canadian politics, especially Conservative Party politics, may have encountered Brian. Brian has been a friend to the Conservative Party here in Canada for a long time. It's in fact, when I first met Brian is when he flew over to Canada in the summer of 2005 to help us prepare for our election campaign against Paul Martin, which eventually came in the late fall of 2005 and an election, the Stephen Harper election win in the early winter of 2006. We met Brian as Brian was the federal director of the Australian Liberal Party at that time. He was from 2002 to 2016. Federal director would translate here to executive director. So it's like being the executive director of the Conservative Party of Canada. And that's a job that Brian had for 14 years. Since then, Brian, of course, has gone on to do other things, both in private business and most currently in politics. He's the vice chairman of the International Democratic Union, for which many of you might know that Stephen Harper's the chair of. So, Brian, thanks very much for joining us on, again, what is a very, very early Melbourne morning.
It's a pleasure and a great privilege to be with you. I've heard so much about the forum over the years.
Good stuff. So we're just going to launch.
Good to see you, Mark.
Well,
and even though it's a very sad day with the death of Prince Philip, the death of Prince Philip is frankly not good news for, in my view, conservatives around the world. But we could perhaps pick that up in a moment. So, Brian, you've had the opportunity to work all over the world and on election campaigns and to observe election campaigns of center-right parties everywhere. I'm just wondering if in your many years, I won't betray your age, but in your many years of observation and practice of politics, do you think there are any absolute principles of campaign architecture? If they are, what are they? And frankly, can you win without them? Like, are they a prerequisite for success? It's a very good question, and it's hard to say that there's absolute principles of architecture. There's obviously absolute principles, and ultimately any political party worth its salt has got to be true to its principles. But there are certainly in my experience, certain things that are prerequisite. And the first point I'd make is that every campaign is different. So to say that you can take the architecture from one campaign and impose it on another one and impose it on another one, it's really not possible. But there are learnings and there are some points that I think that successful campaigns do have in common. Victories are rare and victories are sweet, so they should be savoured. But I think two or three things that I would say that have been in common with the very successful campaigns that I've seen or been part of. Firstly, you should always remember that campaigns are about people's lives. Now, yes, they're about principles, and yes, they're about policies, but they're fundamentally about how those policies and values apply to people's lives and why they're going to make a difference to people. So just keeping in mind, when you're involved in a campaign, how does this relate to individuals, in other words, voters? How is it going to make a difference? It's not just pie in the sky. It's not just theoretical. It's something that does make a practical difference. Having said that, the really successful centre-right campaigns that I've been involved in and that I've seen over the years are true to their values. And I think particularly in the case of Canada of Stephen Harper, in the case of Australia of John Howard, Tony Abbott and others, John Keys in New Zealand, for example, there's plenty of examples. And what I mean by being true to who they are and to the values that they represent, it's not just that they know that, but that they're able to articulate that in a persuasive way.
one of the great traps in politics is that people think that because you've asserted something, you've persuaded. But the skill of being able to persuade is different to the skill of being able to assert. A pressure group can assert. A professor can assert. A university lecturer, a think tank can assert. But politics is about winning. I'm assuming we're not just talking about parties around the edges, but if it's about winning government, it's about persuading. So they have the ability to be true to their values, but to also persuade. The other important thing is that the leaders of campaigns, those involved in campaigns, and that also includes the campaign directors, not just the senior politicians, are able to win the battle to set the terms of the contest. So that the most important battle, in my view, in any election is actually the battle to set the terms of the contest. Is this going to be an election about issues and about matters that play to our strengths, or is it going to be on the turf that the other side argues and represents? Is it going to be about their issues and the things that they're pushing? And having a leadership group, a united leadership group, at both the organisational level and at the political level, the parliamentary level, in our case, that can win that battle to make sure that the election is conducted or a campaign is conducted on the issues and on the turf, if you like, that we best represent. So we're able to play to our strengths, that we're not just reacting all the time, we're playing defensive. Obviously, we need a message that's relevant and that's contemporary. We're not just fighting the last campaign or the campaign before. One of the great dangers in politics is we refight the old war. And one of the particular dangers is if you've lost the last campaign, you're inclined to say, well, if only we'd done X, run more negative advertising or had a different policy or a different leader or a different this or a different that. At the next campaign, everything would be fine. But the next campaign is usually 3, 4 or 5 years down the track and the circumstances have changed. So you've got to be very rigorous and very hard-nosed in analysing where things are when it comes to the campaign and being able to adapt to that and being able to set your campaign to meet the demands of the times. So just don't fight the last campaign or even 2 or 3 campaigns before. Related to that, in my experience, a successful campaign, a successful campaign is also a professional campaign. I think on the centre-right we correctly have a soft spot for the well-intentioned amateur, and there's been really great people involved over the years who've sort of been pretty laid back, if you like, in their approach to campaigns. Those days are well and truly gone. A campaign is a serious business and it requires a very, very high degree of professionalism. You can be sure that the other side will be deeply professional and deeply engaged at every level of the campaign. It's not just at the national level, it's also at the local level. It's not an amateur operation on their side and it shouldn't be on our side. Related to that, a point that the campaigns I've seen have had in common is that there are clear structures and clear lines of authority. So it is very clear who's in charge. It's not a case that, there's sort of a collective and things are a bit blurred and, we sort of get by. Campaigns move at 1 million miles an hour and require constant decisions, and somebody's got to be in charge and somebody's got to make sure that things are happening. And the reason above all that that's important is that you can only have one strategy. You can't have the campaign running a strategy and the tour or the leader and his team running a different strategy. If you've got 2 strategies, you've got zero strategies. There can only be one strategy. It's got to be united. It's got to be in common, and somebody's got to be in charge. But related to that, just remember not to make the perfect the enemy of the good. Often it's easy to say, well, look, this isn't quite right. We'd better stop and make sure we get it right 100% before we move on. Now, politics moves so fast, particularly campaigns, that sometimes you've got to go with 80%. You've got to back your judgment. You've got to go with what you think will get by, because within 24 hours, it'll be something else, and you'll have to make another decision. You'll have to do something else. So don't make the perfect the enemy of the good. Just a final couple of points that I think they've got in common. Elections, certainly in the last 15 or 20 years, I think, are whole-of-term affairs. And what I mean by that is the days of saying, okay, the writs have been issued, the campaign is on now, we'd better start, we'd better get going, they're long gone. The next campaign in Canada is underway. The next campaign in Australia is underway. The next presidential election in the United States is underway. It's all happening. It's whole-of-term affairs. And it's just not the 5 or 6 or whatever it is official period of the campaign. So everything that's happening now matters. They're whole-of-term affairs. If you're a local member of parliament or you're working on the campaign of a local member of parliament, what they're doing now, or a local candidate, what they're doing now is precious time. And it should be considered as part of the campaign. And it should be all directed towards where you want to be at 10 o'clock or whenever on election night. And just related to that, in our systems, a parliamentary system, we're not having a referendum on which party should be yes or no in government, or it's not a presidential election. It's a parliamentary system. So the local campaigns matter as well as the national campaign. The national campaign or the statewide, provincial-wide campaign is what gets the media attention. But the campaigns locally matter. In my experience, they can add 2, 3, 4, 5% to the value of a vote if they're properly executed. Equally, they can cost votes if there's a problem, or if they're amateur in their application of the campaign. So they're just some general observations. I'd be happy to expand on them, but but just to reiterate, there's not sort of a simple architecture you can take from one campaign to another. Each is different, but there are certain things that, in my experience, successful campaigns have in common.
There's a shell of a book there, Brian. I'm wondering if I can expect like the Brian Loughnane textbook on campaigning anytime soon.
No, you don't kiss and tell. I mean, you just tell your friends. You just tell your friends. You don't. You don't tell your enemies.
So let me ask. Assuming I followed all of Loughane's rules, or laws, probably better alliteration. If I followed Loughane's laws and I had run what is a perfect national or a perfect local campaign, could I still lose? Could you give me an example of the perfect campaign that you worked on that still didn't pan out? Or
well, firstly, there is no such thing as a perfect campaign. As I said, there are better and worse campaigns, and a good campaign, in my view, is one that minimises its mistakes and ultimately makes less mistakes than the other side. So there is no such thing as a perfect campaign. But I've been involved in very, very good campaigns that have lost. And one of those was the 2007 election when John Howard, after 12 years in power, when my party here lost. In my view, we ran technically a very good campaign. There was a sort of what we call here an "it's time" factor. There was a feeling in the community that the government had been there a long time, didn't have a clear enough agenda about the future, and just a sense that things were going along well. The economy was strong, so people thought, oh, well, it didn't really matter. We might as well make a change. But the reason why I thought it was ultimately not a bad campaign and a good campaign was what it did was I think we minimised the losses of seats in 2007. And the reason that was important was that the platform that we built on at the subsequent election, when we returned a hung parliament for the first time in 80 years in Australia after one term, we were only able to do that because we were, even though we were defeated in 2007, we weren't devastated. So, but I think the real answer to your question is, government is precious and it shouldn't be thrown away. So there's no such thing as a perfect losing campaign. We're in the business of winning elections, so any loss is bad. But there are instances where you can lose but still do very, very well. So people should consider any time in government to be precious because it's rare and shouldn't be thrown away easily. I guess to put the other side on it, there's a theory which I don't necessarily subscribe to, but quite often you have long-term governments win one election more than they should, and that's just because of people vote habitually or whatever. Fundamentally, they want to make a change, but they're not sure that the other side is ready. But in my experience, what happens in that situation is that at the subsequent election, the loss is greater than it would otherwise be, because there's sort of a pent-up view that, look, these guys have been there too long. Look, but we really weren't sure the other side was right. We wanted to give them a run around the track and have a look at them, and they performed okay. Okay, well, next time around we're going to vote for them. And I think there's been quite a few instances I could think of, particularly at provincial level, where governments have been in for a long, long time. They get re-elected once too often. Now, that contradicts what I said about government being precious. It's impossible to be elected once too often, I think, but I think it probably does happen, and it contributes to
the example I would have thrown at you on that is the UK Conservatives winning the election in '92. They might have been better off losing in 1992. It might have prevented an extended Labour government in post-97, right?
Yeah, to say if your uncle was your auntie, things would be different.
Yeah, my grandmother had wheels.
We'll never know. We'll never know.
Sort of as we're now pulling on threads of ancient elections, which only you and I are old enough to remember, I think, sometimes. But, look, having been at the center of this for decades, right, what do you think's changed? Like strategically or tactically, or even from the standpoint of message, like the Conservative Party that I got involved with here in Canada is, and believe me, this isn't a complaint, bears very little resemblance to the Conservative Party I'm a member of today, right? They're very different places, right?
Well, I think if you're asking from the centre-right point of view.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, we're probably the only ones who remember this, but if I was to say to you, tell me about the centre-right 40 years ago, you would have said Thatcher and Reagan, for example. And what were they on about? It was very clear. You'd be able to say they were on about lower taxes, limited government. They knew who the bad guys were internationally.
Yeah, sure.
Broadly socially conservative, but in a fairly mainstream way, et cetera, et cetera. That was 40 years ago. If I'd said to you, tell me about the centre-right 20 years ago, you would have probably said Stephen Harper, John Howard, John Keyes in New Zealand, even David Cameron, so on and so forth. and they had things in common, which again were similar, derivative, if you like, from Thatcher and Reagan. They were very similar suite of things. If I said to you to tell me about the centre-right today, is it Boris Johnson? Is it Donald Trump? Is it Scott Morrison? Is it Angela Merkel? The answer is it's all of those. It's not just one, and each of them represents completely different strands. So I think that's a way to answer your question directly. I think that there's great confusion at the moment on some core principles on the centre-right around the world, key principles, and I think that is potentially a very, very major problem. There's not a consistency to the extent there was 20 years ago, certainly 40 years ago, in the approach of the centre-right, where you could just say the centre-right government is X. It's sort of roll out the barrel time in most economies, for example, these days. So budget restraint, responsible economic management, whatever.
Let me pull on that, Brian, because someone has, I'm getting questions via my email from folks who are watching this at the moment, and this bleeds in nicely to what they're asking. So what they've said is, COVID has dramatically altered the role of government in people's lives. It's more interventionist than before. You live in Victoria, you know too well about that. Voters seem to have embraced this. How can conservatives stay true to their values and core principles while acknowledging this reality?
Well, my view, this is just my view about that, is one of the hallmarks of conservatism is that we are pragmatic. So we're not about implementing a sort of, we're not like North Korea. We're not trying to implement an ideological model of government, or like the Soviet Union, or whatever. We're not, or Cuba. We're about. There's an element of pragmatism, if you like, that's always applied on the centre right. In the middle of the Second World War, the Conservative leader Winston Churchill didn't sort of stop every day and say, "Look, what am I doing? Totally in line with the conservative fundamental principles of the Conservative Party of the United Kingdom." He did what needed to be done, and I think that there are things that, in a pandemic that need to be done that normally the government would not do. But does that mean, like we're now seeing in the United States, for example, that then translates into a long-term program that transforms the role and nature of government? I think the answer to that, in my view, is no. So we have a pragmatism that meets the needs of the times and assists ordinary people in the community if there's a challenge. That is I think, a totally mainstream and long-standing conservative value or principle or application of it. But does that mean that there's now a guaranteed long-term change? I mean, at some point somebody's going to have to pay for all this, in my view. I don't know about Canada, but in Australia, yes, we print money, but if you keep printing money, it causes a problem.
Well, if you think you're printing money, you should take a look at our fiscal mess here.
Right.
Canada is truly a world leader in something, I'd say.
Yeah. Well, I believe that some of the core values and principles of the centre right still have application. People in your son is going to end up being one of the great taxpayers of recent generations, along with everyone else.
Forward to it.
I think because that's a fundamental, and that is something that we believe on the centre right, and so I do think that yes, there's a moment in time driven by a necessity, the pandemic, but do I think that should completely distort or change or make irrelevant the values of the centre-right? Absolutely not.
So I want to go a little further on this, as it applies directly to political application and campaigning. So my first trip to Australia was in what is the fall here of 2007 to arrive for that 2007 Australian election, and I had the great privilege, along with Patrick Moutart and Doug Finley, of working on that last John Howard campaign with you and other folks in Australia, which was a great thrill for me anyway. And I remember, in sort of the lead up to that campaign and you educating me about Australian voters and the Australian electorate, you were talking about sort of the leafy suburbs of Sydney and Melbourne, and how traditional Liberal voters, or to use the Canadian term, conservative voters, were moving away from what was perceived as their traditional voting pattern, voting for center-right parties and moving more towards the center-left. And I think that had been happening in Canada beforehand. Australia sort of kicked it up into another gear, as it were. We've certainly seen elements of that now in the United States over the past few election cycles, and very particularly the one that gets a lot of ink and a lot of coverage amongst people who follow politics is what happened in either the Brexit referendum vote or the last UK election, with Johnson breaching the red wall of Labour. And I'm wondering, in Australia, because Australia has been a little bit of a canary in the coal mine on this, and, well, frankly, you have elections more frequently than we do. What's coming next? Is that what conservative voters are going to look like? Is it going to be what we would have called back in the 1980s traditional Labour voters? Are those the people who are our target audience now? And the leafy green suburbs, as it were, of Toronto or Vancouver or Calgary, those places are going to be increasingly harder for us to win, out of reach, and we just have to move our focus a little bit. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that the coalition of support for us is evolving, but in my experience, a successful centre-right election campaign, certainly in Australia and in Canada, and I think in the United States, does build on a coalition that includes, for want of a better term, blue-collar workers, or the respectable, responsible upper working class or lower middle class, whatever terminology you want. Australian politics from the centre-right point of view has gone in 4 waves here. The Liberal Party was formed during the Second World War, and Robert Menzies was the leader, and he led the party and was in government. He's our longest-serving Prime Minister. And the coalition that Menzies led to victory was exactly the same coalition that Malcolm Fraser led to victory in 1975 and was in government for 7 or 8 years, which was exactly the same coalition that John Howard was elected with in 1996, which was exactly the model that elected Tony Abbott. And that was a combination of, for want of a better term, voters in the leafy suburbs, but absolutely a working class element, a lower middle class element, tradies, as we call them, tradesmen, ethnic groups, ethnic communities, so on and so forth. Now, is that changing? I think that in some respects it is. I think that the sort of value set that underpinned, for want of a better term, the leafy suburbs is changing. I think a lot of that has to do with the long-term decline of religion, for example. So the sort of value set that was once taken for granted, that was common there, is changed, and the people who live in those suburbs, a different group of people than lived there 40 years ago. But ultimately, elections, this isn't always technically correct, but you'll understand what I mean. You've got to get 50% plus one of the vote. So you've got to build groupings, and successful and long-serving governments are able to do that. And you remember, as Ronald Reagan said, you remember the ones what dance you, or what you brought. Reagan was elected, the famous Reagan Democrats. I mean, it's exactly that. So there's a lot of commentary around, are there new voters, quote unquote, coming to the centre right? Well, there are, and I would hope that there are. But in successful campaigns, that's always been the case. And they have something in common.
Yeah, I think far too often conservatives view this as an either-or dichotomy, and in fact, it's and. It should be plus, not a choice between our old voters and our new voters. It should be our old voters and our new voters, right? We're trying to grow the tent and grow the coalition. We're not trying to pick one group over another. Politics has to be additive, or ultimately, well, you lose. Now, Brian, we're coming close to the end of our time here, and I think, as you know, the Canada Strong and Free Network and its predecessor, the Manning Centre, one of the things that it's excelled at is engaging young people, taking young people into the political process, helping further their political education, inspiring them with policy ideas, et cetera. So just to sort of wind down today, I guess my question for you would be, firstly, how did you come into politics? Like, what was the moment or the thing that said, I, Brian Loughnane, am now going to get active and engaged in politics, or I've been paying attention and I've decided I'm going to do something? And secondly, what advice would you give to all the young folks who are online today watching this and they're saying, I'd really like to do something. I'm a fellow traveler in the center-right movement, and I want to see our ideas and our principles prosper and win. So one, how do you get here? And two, what advice would you give to those folks?
How did I get here?
Without dating yourself too much, of course.
Well, I'm going to, because there's nothing like a really bad government to motivate you. And I was at school, not at university. I was at school when the worst of all governments in Australian history, the Whitlam government, was in power, and they were shocking. And I was involved in the small business side of things, but the particular thing that annoyed me was they offered de jure recognition of the Soviet incorporation of the Baltic states, which is a very boutique factor. And they were also tiptoeing around support for Israel in the Middle East. And even at school, my teachers at that stage were getting very wobbly on support for the Middle East. So it was. I would like to have said that it was a sort of great philosophical moment, but in some ways it was, because it forced nothing like a very bad government to make you think about, what do you actually believe? And it was the experience of living through a bad government that really motivated me to become involved. And I worked in the private sector for a long while, but then eventually got involved professionally in the party, and it sort of went on from there. There's lots of advice I could give to younger people, but maybe two or three key points. The first thing is be involved. It's easy to find a reason not to be involved. It's easy to think that, look, I don't, I'm not, this candidate's not bad, but I'm not particularly enthusiastic about them. But, experience matters. And every campaign you're involved in, you learn something, you gain some experience. So be involved, be involved. I think the very particular thing piece of advice I would give to this group is we're entering an era where knowledge is going to matter. Most people are very poorly read these days. People have a very poor sense of history. They're not really sure where we're coming from or where we've been or why things are the way they are. So taking the time to actually read, and by read I don't mean the sort of 5-minute Twitter thing. I mean read books about biographies, about people who've made a difference in elections on both sides. Read some of the great books about election campaigns. Learn about them. Understand the values and the principles of both us and of our opponents. Where are they coming from? And be able to argue them in some detail. And the other thing which no one does these days, but which I'm a great fan of doing, is go back to original source documents and actually read source documents. And by that, it could be philosophical things. It could be something as simple as a platform of a party. What were the successful Conservative campaigns that you admire, and what was the platform on which they ran? Now, a lot of it would be maybe out of date and not relevant, but I think I almost certainly think that you would find some consistent principles that apply through them. So, but it means apart from anything else, there's going to be very few people who've done that, and you're able to actually, when it comes up in discussion, talk about it. So know your stuff and know it better than anyone else, and know your opponents. And in the age of social media, I think a depth of knowledge and making the effort and the time, and it takes years to develop that. It's a never-ending thing. I'd encourage people very strongly to do that. It'll be at a premium in years to come.
True that. Okay, well, I think that's pretty good advice. I think it's all been really good advice, frankly, but I think that's pretty good advice and a good takeaway for young folks and not so young folks who are watching and with us today. So, Brian, thanks very much for joining us on, a very early Saturday morning in Melbourne. You've got your Geelong flag there in the background. Good luck with that. With that, I think
people probably don't know what that means, but it's the greatest sporting team in the world.
And with that, I will throw this back to Mr. Loughnane. Over to you, Troy. Thanks again, Brian.